The studio of The View was brightly lit, every corner sharply highlighted under the professional lights. Cameras slowly moved across the faces of the hosts, capturing subtle expressions and gestures. Laila Kiran sat at the long table, composed but alert, as Joy Behar began discussing a hotly debated topic. The air in the studio felt thick with tension. A subtle tremor seemed to run through the audience, who were already anticipating a potential clash. Joya spoke loudly and confidently, constantly interrupting Laila. "But you understand that it's completely different." Laila tried to respond, but her words were drowned in Joya's assertive tone. The cameras caught every micro-expression on Laila's face. Lips pressing together, eyes narrowing slightly, fingers tapping nervously on the table. The other hosts exchanged glances. Some tried subtly to intervene, while others watched with quiet interest. Laila made several attempts to speak her mind, but Joya kept cutting her off, as if deliberately refusing to let her finish. The audience could feel the tension rising. Some whispered to each other. Others leaned toward their neighbors to quietly comment on what was happening. The cameras gradually zoomed in on Laila's face, capturing her growing frustration and the effort to maintain composure. Laila tried to speak in a calm, even tone, but each word seemed harder to get out. Meanwhile, Joya appeared increasingly confident, her gestures broad and expressive, and her smile occasionally carrying a hint of mockery. The atmosphere in the studio grew heavier with every passing minute, creating the sense that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the studio had reached a palpable level. Laila Kiran tried to maintain her composure, but every word from Joy Behar chipped away at her patience. "But you have to see it from a completely different perspective." Joya interrupted again, not allowing Laila to finish her thought. Laila took a deep breath, sat up straighter, and tried once more to calmly present her viewpoint. Yet Joya, with a slight, confident smile, cut her off again, overpowering every attempt to speak. The cameras captured Laila's growing irritation, her clenched hands under the table, her fleeting glances at the other hosts, silently seeking support. The other hosts attempted to interject softly, offering brief, neutral comments to diffuse the tension, but their interventions barely made a dent. Every subtle gesture from Laila, the raising of her eyebrows, the slight shake of her head, reflected her mounting frustration, while her smile seemed increasingly forced. The audience in the studio began whispering among themselves, some exchanging concerned glances, others leaning toward neighbors to quietly comment on the escalating argument. The sound of the microphones and cameras amplified every word and pause, making each moment feel even more charged. As Laila paused to gather her thoughts, Joya's dominance in the conversation only grew stronger. Her gestures were broad, her expressions confident, and her tone carried an unmistakable air of authority and subtle mockery. With every passing second, the tension seemed to thicken, as if the slightest spark could ignite a full-blown confrontation at any moment. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Laila Kiran sat rigidly at the table, feeling each word from Joy Behar push her patience to its limit. She took a deep breath, clenching her fists beneath the table, a determined look forming on her face. Every attempt to continue the conversation felt increasingly exhausting, while Joya's words grew louder and more insistent, her tone sharp and unyielding. Laila's eyes swept across the table, briefly locking with those of her fellow hosts, silently seeking some sign of support. The cameras caught every detail, her pressed lips, the subtle hitch in her breathing, the faint tapping of her fingers against the table as she wrestled with the decision in her mind. She tried once more to interject, to assert her perspective, but Joya interrupted again, and this time, Laila felt a surge of finality. With a slow, deliberate inhale, she straightened in her chair, exhaling with quiet resolve. She whispered internally to herself, "Enough." Rising from her seat, Laila moved with measured confidence, though every muscle betrayed the tension she had been holding in. The other hosts attempted to intervene softly, offering cautious words or gestures, but Laila had already made up her mind. Her eyes remained steady, her jaw firm, as she began to walk toward the studio exit. The air seemed to shift in the studio. Cameras followed her deliberate movements, capturing the silent intensity of her decision. The sound of her chair sliding back, the faint scrape of her shoes against the studio floor, and the subtle rustle of her clothing became amplified in the sudden quiet. Every viewer and colleague could sense the weight of the moment. That Laila Kiran's choice to step away was more than just a physical movement. It was a statement of self-respect, patience stretched to its limit, and unspoken defiance against the escalating confrontation. After Laila Kiran left her seat, the studio was enveloped in an unusual silence. The empty chair at the long table drew the camera's focus repeatedly, highlighting the absence in a space that had just been brimming with tension. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances, trying to maintain the flow of the show, yet the dynamic had clearly shifted. The audience began whispering among themselves. Some shrugged in disbelief, others shook their heads in surprise, as if they couldn't quite process the sudden change. The air felt heavier, almost electric, charged with the energy of what had just unfolded. Laila's colleagues attempted to continue the discussion, speaking cautiously and with forced smiles. Their sentences felt slightly strained, the natural rhythm of the show interrupted by her absence. Cameras lingered on the vacant chair, subtly emphasizing what had been lost in the moment of her departure. Meanwhile, viewers on social media had already started reacting, some supporting Laila's decision, others expressing shock or disapproval. The murmurs from the audience seemed to echo these reactions, a tangible ripple of tension in the studio. Every camera angle captured the details: the empty seat, Joya's subtle expressions of concern or discomfort, and the quiet exchanges between the remaining hosts. Even the faint sounds of the studio, the scraping of chairs, the soft rustle of clothing, and the muted voices of the hosts seemed amplified, drawing attention to the changed energy. The show continued, but it was undeniably altered. The absence of Laila Kiran created a void, a palpable shift in tone that everyone in the studio could feel. The atmosphere was now charged with a lingering tension, a sense that the balance had been broken, and that the events of this moment would leave a lasting impression on both hosts and audience alike.